Hello, everybody. Let me talk to my language, Farsi. Please use your instrument. سلام میکنم به حضار گرامی، خانم ها و
Good
آقایان.
evening to all of you, ladies and gentlemen.
باعث افتخار منه
It is indeed a privilege for me
برخی از سیاستمداران صحبت از بستن مرزها
to be here at a time when
صحبت از بستن
there are
مرزها
politicians around the world who are speaking about closing borders and erecting walls to separate people.
در میان
So I'm happy to be among individuals today
نزدیکی
whose
انسان هاست.
aim is to bring human beings closer to each other rather than drive them apart.
دیوار برلین رو همگی به خاطر داریم.
We'll all remember the Berlin Wall
ظرف
and how
مدتی کمتر از یک
within
روز از بین
a
رفت
day
و این سرنوشت هر
they
دیواری
managed to dismantle it.
و هر
And that
مرزی
is the fate
که بین
of
انسان‌ها کشیده
every
میشه.
wall and every border that drives
اما
human beings apart.
از دیوارهای سنگی نمی‌ترسم.
But I'm not afraid of walls,
از دیواری است
of
که
those
بین
walls that
قلب‌ها
are
کشیده میشه.
built with stones and cement.
دیواری که باعث
What I
می‌شود
fear is the wall
به دو
that
قسمت
they
تقسیم
erect
بشه.
to separate
دنیای
people's
ما
hearts.
و دنیای آنها.
I'm afraid of
تمدن
those
ما
who
و
try and
تمدن
divide
آنها.
us as our world
منافع
and their
ما
world,
و
our
منافع آنها.
interests and their interests, our culture
و ما
and their
نباید
culture,
اجازه
and
بدهیم
thus
چنین
driving us
دیواری
apart. We
در
should not
قلب ما
allow such
ساخته
a
بشه.
wall to be erected within our
نتیجه
hearts.
دیواری که در قلب‌ها کشیده می‌شود
Because such a
اسلام
wall
پناسی است.
results in
بیگانه
phenomena
ستیزی
such as Islamophobia, xenophobia,
مخالفت با تنوع فرهنگی است.
opposition to cultural diversity,
ترس از هوموفوبیا
homophobia.
و ما نبایستی اجازه بدیم
We must
چنین
not
دیواری در
allow
قلب‌های
them
ما کشیده بشه.
to build such a wall, erect these
برخی از
walls within our
سیاستمداران
hearts.
با سوء استفاده
Some politicians,
از هراسی
they
که
exploit
خودشون
the
هم
fear that they
ایجاد آن
themselves have played a big part in
تأثیر
creating.
نبوده‌اند، سعی می‌کنند
They are trying to
بین مردم یک جامعه اختلاف بیفته و اونها از همدیگر بترسند.
create discord between people in a
بهترین راه این است
society,
که
make people fear
با
each other,
آشنایی با فرهنگ‌های
fear
یکدیگر
each other's culture.
جامعه رو به هم نزدیک بکنیم
So it's our duty
و
to bring people
بدانیم
closer by
که ارزش‌های
making them
جهانی
familiar with one another's cultures.
مشترکند.
We have to let the world understand
منظور
that global values are all common. They're all the same. And I'm speaking about human rights
ضوابط
here.
اون
I'm
برای
talking
همه
about
ما
human rights
با ارزش
standards that are of great value to each and
و
every
من
one of
امروز
us.
می‌خواهم مختصری صحبت بکنم
So
از
today,
موانع
I'd like to speak to you a little
پیشرفت حقوق
about
بشر در
obstacles
جهان
that
امروز.
impede the development of
و در
human
انتها
rights in today's world.
خواهش می‌کنم هر سوالی
And
داشته
then,
باشید
in the conclusion of my brief
خصوصی
speech, I urge you
مربوط
to
به زندگی
ask me
شخصی من
questions,
و چه
any questions. Feel free to
مربوط
ask
به
me
مسائل
anything,
ایران
be it
و
personal, be
موضوعات
it
سیاسی
political, be it with regards to Iran's
مطرح
situation or any political situation. I'm ready to answer any
اما
questions.
موانع پیشرفت
Now,
حقوق بشر
What are the obstacles that impede the progress of human rights?
ما در عصر جهانی شدن به سر میبریم.
We're living in the era of
Amma
globalization, yet,
متاسفانه
unfortunately, we see
فقط تجارت که
that it's
جهانی میشه
only trade that has become
و
globalized,
ارزش‌ها هنوز جهانی نشده.
and values sadly have
مثال-
not. I'll give you an example.
حتی در اروپا زنان حقوق برابر با مردها رو
Even
کاملا به
in
دست نیاوردن.
Europe, women do not have total equality with men.
و یا حتی در بین جوامع که در اروپا زندگی میکنن
In
می‌بینید
European societies, you come
مثل
across
ختنه زنان دیده میشه.
issues such as female genital mutilation, FGM, taking place in the West. Although it's been banned by the law, yet it still happens.
این یعنی اینکه اون ارزش ها هنوز مورد
What does
قبول
that
قرار
mean?
نگرفته.
That means that values have not become standardized throughout the world.
بنابراین اینکه چرا این ارزش ها جهانی نشده هنوز
And as to why these such values have not become globalized, there are several reasons for that, the most important of which I'm going to highlight.
سوء استفاده از دین
And that is
و ایدئولوژی.
when religion and ideology are exploited by non-democratic countries.
مخصوصا اسلامی
Now, these non-democratic countries, especially Islamic ones, they claim
که چون ضوابط حقوق بشر
they
غربیه
claim that human rights
با
standards
اسلام
are West,
همخوانی
they
نداره.
emanate from the West and they're
ما
not
چون
compatible with
مسلمانیم
Islam. And they claim that because
نمی‌تونیم به
we
اونها
are
احترام
Muslims,
بگذاریم.
we should not observe
به همین دلیل
these Western human rights criteria, which is why
وضعیت حقوق زن
you can see that in Islamic countries, in women's rights in Islamic countries are very discriminatory. And I ascribe the reason for that to the Sharia law.
یا در کشور من ایران
In my country,
جمهوری اسلامی
Iran, or I should say the
از
Islamic
سال
Republic of Iran,
1979 در اون
which
تأسیس شده.
has been an Islamic republic since 1979.
قوانین تبعیض‌آمیز زیادی
There
علیه
are
زنان
many
به تصویب رسید.
discriminatory laws against the women.
من چند نمونهش رو براتون میگم.
And I'm going to highlight
ارزش
a few
جان
of them.
زن
For instance,
نصف ارزش جان مرده
in my country,
طبق قانون.
based on the law,
یعنی اگر من
a woman's life is worth
برادرم
half
با
that
هم
of a
بریم
man.
خیابون،
For instance, if my brother and I are walking along the street and we are hit by a
یا
car
یک تروریست به ما حمله
or a
می‌کنه
terrorist attacks us,
و هر دو یکسان هم
and
زخمی بشیم،
if we are both
خسارتی
injured,
که به برادرم میدن 2 برابر خسارتی است که به من تعلق میگیره.
the compensation awarded to my brother in the Iranian court of law would be twice as much to the compensation awarded to me. Why? Because I'm a woman and he's a
طبق
man.
قانون شهادت 2 مرد
Another instance, based on Iranian law, the testimony of 2 women is tantamount to the testimony of 1 man in a court of law. So, to all intents and purposes, women are considered to be half the value of a man.
یک مرد میتونه 4 تا زن
A
بگیره.
man in my country can have up to 4 wives.
و همه این قوانین در کشوری اجرا میشه
And all these laws
که بیش از 60% از دانشجویان
are being implemented in a country where over 60% of students are female.
کشوری است که زناش تحصیل کرده تر از
Iran
مردها هم
is a
هستند.
country where women are better educated than
زنان
men.
ایران
Yet this is
60
happening.
سال قبل
Iranian women
حق
some
رأی به
60
دست آوردن
years
و به
ago
پارلمان رفتن
were allowed to vote and enter parliament.
انتخاب شدن به عنوان نماینده. حتی قبل از زنان سوئیس
Even
حق رأی ما
before
داشتیم
women in Switzerland were given the vote,
و در سال
Iranian women had
1979
achieved that.
که انقلاب
Yet
اسلامی
in
شد
1979, when an Islamic
سوء استفاده
revolution
از
was staged
اسلام
in Iran, the authorities, they exploited
و با
Islam, the
به
name
عنوان
of
اینکه
Islam.
حقوق بشر
And under the pretext
با اسلام
that
مغایر
human
است
rights is a Western concept
ما
and is
همه حقوق رو از دست
incompatible
دادیم.
with Islam, we women,
و آیا
we became deprived of all our rights.
این ادعای درستی است؟
And now
مسلماً
the
نه.
authorities claim that
مسلمانان مدرن
human rights are not compatible with Islam. Is that right? Absolutely not. Progressive Muslims have proven, based on Islam itself, that Islam is compatible with human rights in every way.
یعنی با تفسیر درستی از اسلام
In other words,
ما می
with a
توانیم
correct
به حقوق بشر
interpretation of
احترام
Islam,
بگذاریم و اون رو اجرا بکنیم.
we can respect human rights in our country and we could abide by it.
مانند
And if
ایران،
Islamic governments such as Iran,
امارات
Saudi Arabia,
متحده
the
عربی،
United Arab Emirates,
کویت
Kuwait,
اینها
if all
وضعیت
these
بدی در
Islamic
حقوق بشر دارند
countries
به خاطر اسلام نیست.
are known for violation of human rights, it is not because of Islam, it's because they are
به خاطر
dictators.
دیکتاتوری سیاسیه.
It is because of political
به همین دلیل
dictatorship
مثلا
and not
در
Islam.
عربستان به خاطر گفتن یک شعر
For instance, in Saudi Arabia,
و نوشتن یک مقاله
if somebody writes a poem or writes an article that is not pleasing to the authorities, that person is imprisoned for many years. Or in Pakistan,
به خاطر انتقاد از
if
قوانین
anyone criticizes
بد و
the
تبعیض‌آمیز
discriminatory laws in that country, that person is accused of apostasy and they sentence that person to death. All these are exploitation of a religion. And what is interesting is that both Islamic governments and Islamic governments claim that God, and I mean their God, not everyone else's God, they claim that God is against this human rights. And not only Islamic countries, but also countries that don't believe in any religion. They violate human rights. For instance, China. It's not a religious country, yet it is against human rights. You may have heard of a Chinese Nobel laureate, Liu Xiaobo. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in absentia in 2013. Liu Xiaobo was imprisoned for many years in China because he was a dissident. And while in prison, he suffered from cancer, and because he was not allowed to receive treatment, he died. And currently, Liu Xiaobo's wife is under house arrest in China. Or look at North Korea. They're not Muslims. And look at the predicament of the North Korean people. So what I'm trying to say
عدم اعتقاد به خدا
is that
بهانه‌ای شده برای
different
ستم به
countries,
مردم.
be they Muslim or be they
به همین
non-Muslim,
دلیله
but
که
dictatorial,
حکومت‌های
they use any
مبتنی بر
pretext,
ایدئولوژی
any ideology or religion as
ایدئولوژی
pretext in order
مذهبی
to
و ضد
abuse
مذهبی
human rights.
سوء استفاده می‌کنند برای اینکه به مردم ستم بکنن.
And why do they do that? Because they want to
و اما
oppress their people.
عامل دومی که مانع پیشرفت حقوق بشر در
Now,
جهان
the
میشه
second factor that impedes the progress of human rights
مبارزه
throughout
با
the world
تروریسم.
is the fight against terrorism.
به اسم مبارزه با تروریسم
In the name of fight against
آزادی‌های
terrorism,
فردی رو کم می‌کنند.
they are taking away
ایمیل‌ها
individual freedoms.
و
They're controlling
مکاتبات
people's
خصوصی
personal
مردم رو کنترل
emails
می‌کنند.
and private communications in the name of fighting terrorism.
مثلا در آمریکا
For instance, in the
قانونی
United States,
گذشته
they have passed a law
که تا افرادی که تابعیت 7 کشور رو دارند از جمله ایران
based on which people who
اینها
come from 7
خطرناکند.
countries, which includes Iran,
و به اینها ویزا داده نمی
should not be given
در
visas
موارد
because they
استثنایی
are
و محدود.
deemed dangerous unless there are exceptional
واقعا
circumstances.
این حرف آیا واقعا می شود تمام مردم یک کشور رو
Now,
تروریست خواند؟
can you generalize people
آیا این
in
سوء
one country?
استفاده
Can you call them all terrorists because
از
they come
احساس
from a
عدم
certain country?
امنیتی که
Is that
در
not
مردم ایجاد کردن نیست؟
abusing the sense of insecurity that they themselves have
و
created
نظائر این مسائل در دنیا
by
متاسفانه زیاد
provoking
اتفاق
them
میفته.
against certain nations? And unfortunately, such instances have
مانع
been
دیگر
happening a lot throughout the world. Another
پیشرفت
factor
حقوق
which
بشر در جهان
impedes human rights progress around the world
سوء استفاده ابزاری
is
از حقوق بشره.
those
یعنی
who try and exploit human
حقوق
rights
بشر
for their own benefit.
برای مقاصد سیاسی سوء استفاده می شود.
I mean, they abuse human rights for their political
می‌خواهند به
gains.
کشوری حمله بکنند
They want an excuse to
میگویند برای اینکه
attack
می‌خوایم
a country.
دموکراسی رو ببریم.
And what excuse do they use? They
آیا
say,
می‌شود
oh, we need to
دموکراسی رو
attack this
همراه
country because
بمب‌های
uh,
خوشه‌ای
we
به سر
um,
مردم
want to
بریزند؟
make sure we establish democracy in that country. Now,
چه حرفیه؟
by throwing
می‌گویند
cluster bombs, do you bring democracy to a country?
حمله نظامی می‌کنیم برای اینکه وضعیت زنها در اون کشور بد است و بهترش می‌کنیم.
They say, oh no, we are going to launch a military
بهبود
attack against such and such country
وضعیت حقوق
to
بشر با
help improve
حمله
women's
نظامی
condition in
سازگاره؟
that country.
اینا در حقیقت
No,
سوء
so
استفاده از
these are
نام حقوق
other
بشر است
ways
برای
of
اینکه
exploiting human
مقاصد
rights
سیاسی خودشون رو
for political
حکومت‌ها پیش
gains.
ببرند.
Because some countries have their own
اما عامل
political
چهارم
agendas, so they use human rights to
چرا حقوق بشر
achieve those ambitions. Now,
پیشرفت لازم
the
رو نداشت؟
fourth factor. Why is it that human
دلیل
rights
که
has not been as progressive as it should have been?
بیشترین تمرکز در زمینه حقوق بشر روی مسائل سیاسی بوده.
The reason is that
مثل
they have
آزادی‌های-
focused
آزادی
human
بیان،
rights
حق تحصیل.
on political issues such as
اما
freedom of expression, freedom of
جنبه دیگر
education,
اون
but
خیلی
its
کم
other
بهش
aspect
توجه
of
شده.
human rights has been more or
یعنی
less
مسائل حقوق
neglected,
اقتصادی.
such as economic rights.
چون شما میدانید که حقوق بشر 4 بخش مهم داره.
I'm sure you know that
حقوق
human
مدنی،
rights is made up of civil
سیاسی،
rights, political rights,
اقتصادی
economic
و
rights,
اجتماعی.
and social rights.
حقوق اقتصادی خیلی کم کار شده.
And they seem to have neglected economic rights.
در کشوری در جهانی که ما زندگی می‌کنیم
Which is why in the
میلیون‌ها
world that we
نفر
live in today, there are millions who are hungry.
طبق گزارش سازمان بین المللی خاربار
Based on the World Food
با
Organization,
غذاهایی که از رستوران‌های آمریکا و اروپا
the food that is
دور ریخته می‌شود
put in garbage cans in
می‌توان
restaurants in the West,
در قاره آفریقا
they could
از بین
feed the whole of the African continent's hungry
همچنین.
people.
طبق گزارش‌ها
Also,
بیش از 80% ثروت جهان
over 80% of the
در
world's
اختیار
wealth
1% مردم جهانه
is in the hands of 1% of the world's population.
و در چنین دنیایی ما چگونه میتوانیم
So,
صحبت از
How
برابری
can we
بکنیم؟
talk about equality in such a world? What equality?
آیا بچه‌ای که در این کشور به دنیا میاد و امکاناتی
A
که براش
child
میذارن
that is born in this country
معادل هست
with
با
all
بچه‌ای
the
که در
facilities given
فرض
to that
کنید
child?
سومالی به دنیا میاد
Is that child having the
هم
same
همین
kind of
امکانات داره؟
life as the child
همین
born
تحصیل رو
in, for
می‌کنه؟
instance, Somalia? No.
و 20 سال بعد
And in 20 years' time,
بین اینها چه تفاوتی به وجود خواهد آمد؟
how different do you think that child who was born here is going to be to the child who was born in
در
Somalia?
جهان رو به گسترشه.
Sadly, poverty is growing rapidly throughout the world.
سازمان ملل متحد اولین هدف خودش رو
To such an extent that the UN,
کاهش
in its
گرسنگی قرار داده.
Millennium Goals,
یعنی ببینید
has given
گرسنگی
priority
در
to
جهان چه میزان
reducing
اهمیت
hunger.
داره.
So that tells you how important hunger is throughout the world, which is what the UN main priority has become.
توجهی به حقوق اقتصادی.
So why is this hunger existing in the world? Because of the neglect of economic rights. Now, there is also a fifth factor impeding human rights progress, and that is
سازمان ملل متحده.
the weak performance of the United Nations.
در سازمان ملل متحد تصمیمات اساسی و مهم در شورای امنیت
As I'm sure you all know, the most important decisions are made by the UN Security Council.
قدرت‌های بزرگ جهان حق وتو دارند.
And in the Security Council, the world
بشار
powers have a right to veto.
چندین بار بمب شیمیایی بر
Now,
سر مردم
Syrian
شیخ
President Bashar al-Assad has subjected his people to chemical attacks for so many times, yet,
جنایت فراوانی کرد.
and to remain in power,
تمام کشور
he
رو
has
نابود کرد.
decimated his own country and killed so many people. He has committed crimes against humanity.
کیس بشار اسد
So the case of Bashar al-Assad was referred to the UN Security Council so many times, yet every time it was vetoed.
مواجه شد و برگشت و الان بشار اسد
And now look at what's happening in Syria.
جسد مرده ها را میره
Bashar al-Assad is walking on the corpses of his people, and he's proud that
در چنین
he is
جهانی
victorious.
و با چنین
So
سازمان
in
ملل
such a world,
متحدی
and with such a weak United Nations,
شاهد اجرای
how can we
و
possibly
پیشرفت
witness
بشر باشیم.
improvements in human rights? How can we see it promoted?
این بخشی از مشکلات بود.
Now, this is part of the problem.
اما مایلم اضافه کنم از این مشکلات
What I would like to add is
بزرگتر و فراتر
that there is an even
اراده
bigger problem.
افرادی است که اعتقاد به حقوق بشر دارند. ما پیروز میشیم.
And I think there
کسانی که
is
این ضوابط رو بهش
one
اعتقاد
way
دارند
we can make sure that these
آنقدر
problems are
مبارزه
removed.
خواهند کرد
And what is that? That is through us defenders of human rights, because we have such a great resolve that we are not going to give up. We are going to make sure that human rights is promoted and there is progress. Yes, there are many problems. There are many, many problems, but our resolve is far greater than the greatest of problems in the way of human rights. And I promise you that we, defenders of human rights, will not give up. We, defenders of human rights, promise you we will make sure that we are with you and we will ultimately have victory. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ebadi. You said that we could ask you personal questions, and so I'm going to ask you a personal question about what your favorite thing to eat is, and why, because I'm a powerful believer in food as a way to break down boundaries between people.
خیلی ممنونم از این سوالی.
Thank you very much for your question.
منم مثل شما
Like you,
به غذا علاقه
I
دارم
love food.
و هیکل من که چاقه
And
نشون
just
میده
look
که
at my
چقدر
obese
علاقه دارم.
body, and that is proof enough that I love food.
کشورهای زیادی میرم.
I travel to many countries around the world, and wherever I travel
فقط
to,
غذای محلی
I only ask for the local food.
و همیشه هم از سرآشپز سوال
And I
میکنم
always ask the head chef in whichever restaurant I go to, that what is a speciality in your country?
همه چیز میخورم.
So I eat
اما
everything.
توی غذاها
But
خودم شخصا
personally,
بادمجون
I love
خیلی علاقه دارم.
aubergines a lot. Or eggplant, as they say in the United States.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that speech, Dr. Ebadi. I've had the privilege to work both for the White House and in the United Nations, and I very much agree with what you're saying about human rights. I think typically in the West, we want to help women in the Middle East, but we often get tied down in conversations about hijab, and even the best of us try and sort of divert the conversation about hijab to women's education, to be able to provide opportunity for women and to focus on education rather than on women wearing hijab. But given what you're saying, that 60% of the student body in Iran are female, what should we focus on as allies to help improve the conditions of women living under Sharia?
بهترین کاری که
The
آمریکا
best
میتونه
thing that the
بکنه
United States can do to help,
بهترین کاری که آمریکا
I
میتونه
repeat, the best thing that
برای
the
بهبود
US can do
وضعیت
to
حقوق
improve
بشر در کشور من
the human rights in my country or elsewhere
این است که هیچ
in the
کاری
region
نکنه.
is to do nothing.
ما مردم هر کشور
We, in whatever
مبارزه
country
می‌کنند
we come
برای
from,
بهبود
we will
حقوق
fight
بشر.
ourselves to improve human rights in our
خارجی
countries. Foreign intervention
مبارزه ما رو
will
خراب
only
می‌کنه.
impede our own resistance.
اجازه بدید مردم بجنگن پیروز
Please
میشن.
allow our
اما
own people to do their own
یک مسئله
fights and they will achieve victory.
دیکتاتورها رو
But
کمک
what
نکنید.
is important and what you can do is not to help dictators. Do not help dictators in the Middle East, such as dictators in Iran,
کاراپشن بسیار بالایی دارن
who are tainted with corruption.
و این پولا کجا میره؟
And where does their dirty money
بانک‌های
go?
اروپایی
It
و
ends up
آمریکایی
in US and European
پولهای کثیف
banks.
دیکتاتورها رو قبول
Do
نکنید.
not accept the dirty money of these dictators.
هر دیکتاتوری که از کار برکنار میشه میاد توی اروپا
Now, any
یا
dictator
آمریکا بر حسب روابطی که
who is
دارن
deposed
با پولهای
ends up residing in the US or in Europe and living off all the money they have stolen from their own countries, buying mansions and living happily. Do not allow these dictators to enter your countries. Do not accept their dirty money. Do not sell them arms.
سازمان ملل متحد اعلام کرده
The United Nations
نیمی از
has
اسلحه‌ای
declared
که در
that
جهان
half
تولید میشه
the weapons manufactured in the world
فروخته شده.
is sold to the dictators in the Middle
ببینید
East.
اون منطقه رو چطور با آتش کشیدند.
You see how they have set that region on fire? Do not give them weapons.
سیاه رو قبول
Do not
نکنید.
accept the black money from these dictators.
دیکتاتورها رو کمک نکنید.
Do not help these dictators in any way and allow our own people to do their own struggle and be sure they will achieve victory.
Good night, Doctor, and welcome to Kings, and thank you for all your words. And my question is, coming from a country in a similar situation where the women's rights are recognized by the law and whatever, but the real situation is quite different. My question is, what would you say that is the specific events that change women's history in Iran that may serve as an example for the rest of the world, as countries as Mexico or Latin America in general, where, well, our situation is an obvious disadvantage in front of men?
چیزی که باعث بهتر شدن وضعیت حقوق زن میشه
What will contribute to improving women's rights is raising awareness among women
برای
and to encourage them to fight for equality.
اجازه بدید من کمی ریشه‌ای صحبت کنم.
Let me speak a bit about the root
آنچه که
of the
باعث
matter.
می‌شود وضعیت زنان
Now,
تبعیض‌آمیز بشه مذهب
what
نیست
makes women's situation discriminatory is not
بلکه
religion.
فرهنگ پدرسالاره
It is patriarchal culture
و منظور من
that
از
causes
فرهنگ
these
پدرسالار
discriminations. And what do I mean by patriarchal culture?
جنس مذکر نیست.
By patriarchal culture, I'm not attacking
منظور من
male species.
فرهنگ غلطی است
What I
که
mean
برابری
is the
انسان‌ها
wrong
رو قبول
culture
نداره.
that does not believe in gender equality.
این فرهنگ
It is such a culture
در خانواده
that exists
زن ستم میکنه برای اینکه برابری
everywhere. In
انسان‌ها رو
families,
قبول نداره.
it's women who are subjected to this inequality at home.
دموکراسی رو قبول نداره.
And in politics, this culture does not believe in democracy because it doesn't believe in equality of human beings, which is why you can see in countries that are more democratic and there is greater democracy, the situation of women is much better.
دموکراسی عقب افتاده تر باشه
And in countries where they lag behind in democratic terms, the situation of women is far
اون چه که
worse.
باعث می شود ما با این فرهنگ مبارزه بکنیم این است که بدانیم این
Now,
فرهنگ
to
چیست
fight this culture, we have to understand this culture, and we have to understand its modus operandi.
در این فرهنگ
in this
هرچند
culture,
زنان قربانی این
although
فرهنگ هستند،
women are victims,
اما متاسفانه
but unfortunately,
گاهی از اوقات
there are
خودشون
times when
انتقال
women
دهنده
are
این
also
فرهنگ غلط هم هستند.
promoting this wrong culture.
فراموش نکنیم هر مرد زورگویی به هر
Please
حال
don't forget
در
that
دامن
any
یک
man
زن،
who is
یک
a bully
مادر
has been
پرورش
raised by a
پیدا
woman,
کرده.
by his mother.
من این فرهنگ از هر چیزی برای توجیه خودش
Now, this
استفاده
culture
می‌کنه.
uses whatever it can in order to justify itself, including religion.
به عنوان مثال
For instance,
میدونیم که ادیان ابراهیمی یعنی مسیحیت،
we know the Abrahamite
یهودی و
religions,
اسلام،
Christianity,
اینا
Judaism,
تقریباً ریشه
Islam,
واحد دارن.
they all more or less have common roots.
و در همه این ادیان
And in all these aforementioned religions,
گناهکار بزرگ یک
who
زن.
is the biggest sinner? A woman.
به عنوان مثال
For instance,
مسیح باید کشته بشه برای پاک کردن گناه
Christ
اولیه. گناه اولیه‌ای که
gave
حوا
up his
مرتکب
life
شده.
in order to,
و به خاطر گناه حوا همه
because
نوع
of the
بشر
original
بایستی
sin.
از بهشت اخراج
And
شدن.
why? Because Eve, that
Hawa
woman,
kiye?
had been a
بهشت
sinner.
کجا بوده؟
Now, who is Eve? Where is
حوا
paradise?
چیکار کرده
What
بود؟
did Eve do?
اگه خدا عادله
If God is just,
پس چرا به خاطر
why
گناه
is
یک
it that
نفر
this God,
همه
because of the
بشریت
sin
باید
of
تبعیض
this
بشن؟
one woman, he or
این
she
چه
decided
تفسیری
to
از کتاب
banish the
مقدسه؟
whole human beings from paradise?
این
What
تفسیر
interpretation of
تفسیر
the
مردانه
holy
است.
books is that?
مردها
It's an
همیشه
interpretation by
نشستن
men
که کتاب
It's
مقدس رو
men
تفسیر کردن
who've been
و
interpreting
بعد
the holy books.
حالا یه عده‌ای میگوین مذهب ضد زنه. نه،
And now they're saying,
حالا
oh,
وقت اومده
religion
که
is
زنها
against women.
خودشون مذهبشون رو یاد بگیرن و اونها
Now,
تفسیر کنن.
time has come for women
این یه مثال
to
ساده
study
است
their religions and to interpret their
که
religion.
بدانید فرهنگ
Now, this was just a
پدر
small
سالار چگونه
example
عمل میکنه.
to show you how this patriarchal culture works.
برای مبارزه با این فرهنگ
To fight this
دانش
patriarchal
و
culture,
تحصیلات بسیار مهمه.
we need education. That is
بایستی
imperative.
زنها رو کمک کرد
We
که
have
هرچه
to
بیشتر
help women
تحصیلات داشته باشند
to become as educated as men and even more
بتوانند
so that they
شغلی
can
داشته باشند که استقلال مادی داشته باشند.
earn their livings
استقلال
without depending on
اقتصادی و
men.
دانش دو عامل
Economic
رهایی
independence
و
and
مبارزه
knowledge
اصلی برای زنان
is what frees women from this culture.
زنها رو کمک کنید
So
به این دو
please
عامل
help
برسند.
women to achieve these two.
خیلی ممنون دکتر عبادی واقعا افتخاری
Thank you very much, Dr. Abadi. I was honored to hear your speech. I wanted to ask you, if possible, could you speak about your Nobel Women's Initiative, the NGO that you have set up with fellow female Nobel laureates? And could you say a few words about what you do around the world? And could you please also say how important it is that people who work in places like King's College or in law firms, please tell us what we can do here to help women.
So one of the biggest challenges that is experienced by societies who live under anti-democratic regime is brain drain. And people who are more educated, more secular, including human rights lawyers, but not necessarily only human rights lawyers, tend to leave their country, which actually facilitate the anti-democratization of these societies and these countries. So what is the role of civil society and human rights lawyer in this regards, and what is your thoughts on this?
Perfect.
Good evening, Dr. Ebadi. It was an honor to listen to you, and it was very inspiring. I'm Sharad Davla from India Network for Basic Income. Quick question is, you have touched upon very, very significant points. One is that when we talk of human rights, somehow we are silent about economic rights. And UN being not as strong as it could be, or it's a weak organization. And the third is that globalization of trade, but not globalization of values. I think coming from this, since I am coming from basic income movement, what kind of path do you suggest on the question of economic rights? Because there are two important issues that I would like to raise. One is the unpaid work of the care work of the women, that is the patriarchy steals women's labor. And the second is the modern slavery, which also steals human labor. So could you please reflect on that? Thank you.
You asked a very good question about the brain drain. In some instances, human rights defenders and highly educated people, as you said, they are forced to leave these countries. But do you think when they leave their countries, they have abandoned their homelands? No. Those who have been forced into exile or migration, they are duty-bound to use the freedom of expression in order to echo the problems of their own people throughout the world in important organizations such as the UN, such as the Human Rights Council, such as the European Parliament. They have to act as megaphones for their own people. I am one of such people. I have been out of my country since 2009 because I was forced to leave my country. I didn't leave my country because I'm afraid of being imprisoned. I have experienced imprisonment. I'm not afraid of that. And I know I can endure life in prison. However, what point would I serve by being behind bars, except being unable to make sure that the world could hear my voice? So it's better for me to be in a place where I can be of greater benefit to my own people. And because in Iran we've been subjected to very intense censorship for many, many years, I, in exile, am using my freedom of expression to be the spokesperson for my own people. So I haven't abandoned my homeland, Iran. I may not be physically in Iran, but spiritually I am in Iran, and my heart is in Iran, and my work is focused on Iran. As a result of which I travel 10 months a year to make sure the world hears about the situation in Iran, so that the world understands that Iranians do not want this regime, that we deserve a better regime. I did not sleep last night because I was giving a speech in Oregon, at the university in Oregon, and I was speaking about human rights. I only arrived in the UK a few hours ago. I was jet-lagged, yet I decided to come here and speak to you. That is why I think anyone who is highly educated and for whatever reason has left their country that is in the hands of dictators, they have very, very heavy duties, and that duty is to make sure they are spokespersons for their own people to make sure the voices of their people are heard outside the world. Now, regarding economic rights and what tools we have, my dear friend, the most important thing we can do is to make sure military expenditure throughout the world is reduced. Countries like Pakistan or India, where there are so many poor people, why do they need to have atomic bombs? Do you know how costly it is to maintain the nuclear state? And you know what these atomic waste does to the environment. Therefore, if you want to fight poverty, it would be really good if you try and feed the poor maybe once a day, but that is not enough. In my view, to fight poverty, you have to eradicate the roots of poverty. And there are two factors that contribute to poverty. One is corruption, and the other is the high military expenditure. Fight these two factors, and then you will see that poverty will diminish. So it's not enough just to go round with a begging bowl asking people to help the poor so we can feed them once a day. That is no remedy. Now, with regards to Nobel Women's Initiative, NWI, which is an NGO I set up with female Nobel laureates, after I won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2003, a year after that, I went to Kenya to take part in a congress. I was there with Jody Williams, who is another Nobel laureate, and I remember the congress was about mines, ground mines and land mines, and how to eradicate landmines. And Jody Williams had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. She's from the United States because of her fight against landmines. And the two of us, as I said, we were in Kenya and we were both participating in a seminar on landmines. And then we heard that the 2004 Nobel laureate was also a woman, Wangari Maathai, who sadly passed away a few years ago. So, three of us Nobel laureates found ourselves together in Kenya. So I used that opportunity by proposing to the other two that we set up an NGO together and use the spotlight on us, Nobel laureates, in order to promote women's rights throughout the world and to fight militarization. And fortunately, my fellow female Nobel laureates accepted my proposition, and many more of them joined us. Of course, we have a prerequisite for any female laureate who wants to join our NGO. We don't accept any female laureates such as Aung San Suu Kyi who have political ambitions, because she's a politician, she's not an activist. Also, Mrs. Sirleaf, who was the former president of Liberia, she is not also a part of us because she is also a politician. So there is 7 of us who are members of the Nobel Women's Initiative, 7 women who are Nobel laureates, and we are using all the facilities at our disposal in order to improve women's situations throughout the world. And I will highlight the last thing we did, our NGO did. Few months ago, our NGO, we went to Bangladesh. We went to Bangladesh-Myanmar border, to Cox's Bazar, in order to inspect the plight of the Myanmar refugees, the Rohingya refugees. And we took some journalists with us with cameras to highlight the plight of the Rohingya refugees. And I followed that up in Geneva when I met with a truth-finding commission that has been set up by the United Nations in order to look into this genocide of the Rohingya Muslims by the Myanmar military. We compiled evidence and testimony from these refugees during our visit to the border, and we gave them to that UN commission so that we could raise this issue as an act of genocide and ethnic cleansing. We should not allow this genocide to be forgotten. We must not allow criminals to flee justice. We must not allow crimes against humanity to be neglected, because by neglecting them, we will be allowing other crimes to take place around the world with impunity. We have to fight such crimes, and I highlighted that because that is part of our NGO's work. So thank you very much for your patience, for having listened to me.